This podcast is supported by our friends at Bayer Pharmaceuticals, silver partners of GUcast.
Team GB Olympic champion Sir Chris Hoy has revealed that his cancer is terminal.
Focused our attention on some sad news that broke last night with regards to the six-time Olympic cycling champion Sir Chris Hoy, who has announced that he has terminal cancer.
People over the weekend quite shocked to find that he's now revealed that he's suffering from terminal cancer.
Speaking to the Sunday Times, he said he's been told he has between 2 and 4 years to live.
But Hoy says he's feeling optimistic, positive, and is still living his life as normal.
Yeah, so there you go. That was big news last month.
Yeah, absolutely. Big news. And he's been so gracious throughout it all. And I think he's been a real sporting hero to many people. But yeah, it really brings into light these early diagnoses of aggressive prostate cancer.
So you're very welcome to this episode of GUcast. What you heard at the start there was some news headlines from the UK just a couple of weeks ago when the great Sir Chris Hoy, legend of cycling, six-time Olympic gold medalist, I think over 4 Olympics, 11-time world champion, who's currently 48, I think, came out and said that he's got very advanced prostate cancer. And it got a lot of media attention and a lot of us very upset, people who adore Chris Hoy. So what we want to talk about today is about the so-called Chris Hoy effect of what it's like when, you know, a very big, well-known person chooses to go public with prostate cancer is what we're talking about today, with their personal story. Because it does send out ripples, doesn't it, Renu?
Absolutely, and I think one of the key things about the Chris Hoy story is that he was diagnosed at an earlier age than many of our screening guidelines would even recommend PSA screening.
That's the whole
thing. So that's
thing.
The scary part.
If you start at 50, it wouldn't have mattered for Chris Hoy, who turned up with metastases. We'll hear a bit from Chris Hoy in a minute. But yeah, to celebrate this episode, we have a couple of guests in the studio.
I love it when we have a full studio.
Yes, Ben Challacombe, welcome back, friend of the podcast.
Hello, Ben.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be back in Melbourne.
Yeah, so Ben, who was a Melbourne fellow, trained here with Tony Costello, is it 10 years ago? It must be.
More than that.
Because we swapped over.
09.
It's about 14 years ago. And he's a consultant urologist at Guy's and St. Thomas's. And he's been quite involved in one of these big stories before. We're going to talk about the so-called Stephen Fry effect back in 2019 when the great Stephen Fry came out and told his story about prostate cancer and Ben looked after him. Mm-hmm. And a friend of the podcast and advisor to our podcast, Daniel Moon, Professor Daniel Moon, colleague of ours.
Welcome back,
It's fantastic to be with Ben as well. It's a bit of a reunion, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
From many years ago.
And it was a good excuse to have Ben back in the studio, but especially to talk about the Chris Hoy effect. And look, what I'm going to do for a moment is actually play a bit of the clip that he did when he was interviewed on the BBC just last week when he talked about the shock of receiving this diagnosis. So for context, he was diagnosed actually a year ago or a bit over a year ago. And he's talking here about when he was diagnosed, but what we didn't know that. And then this year, he's revealed that his cancer has now become presumably castration resistant. So this is Chris Hoy telling his story.
It's been the toughest year of our lives so far by some stretch. September 2023, I got the news that I had a terminal illness. So I've got stage 4 prostate cancer, completely out the blue. No symptoms, no warnings, nothing. All I had was a pain in my shoulder and a bit of pain in my ribs. You know, I'm 48 years of age now, still lifting weights in the gym, still exercising hard. I just thought it was aches and pains. But this ache and pain didn't go away. And eventually they suggested go for a scan. I assumed it was going to be tendinitis or something. When the scan result came back, it was a tumour. And it was the biggest shock of my life. I remember the feeling of just absolute horror and shock. It was like a living nightmare. I'll never forget the words, you know, it's incurable, but it's manageable. The stakes are much higher now. It felt like life and death in the moment when you were battling it out for an Olympic gold medal, but the stakes have changed dramatically and it is life and death. But I guess the principle is the same. It's about focusing on what you have control over and not worrying about the stuff that you can't control.
Wow, there you go, Renu.
Yeah, incredible words from Chris Hoy.
Yeah, and I suppose we're all 4 urologists here, and we've got a very special patient joining us in a few moments as well to tell his story. Andrei Norris is joining us. But we all sit at the other side of the table, but it is always very sobering, Dan, isn't it, when you hear a patient tell how it seems from the other side of the table. Yeah.
That's horrific, and what a shock for anyone, but yet alone at such a young age. And it's frustrating when we're still grappling with having screening accepted, let alone
working out stratifying to men who benefit the most, which is those who have the most to lose, which is those men who are young and otherwise fit, well functioning. That's a tragedy. It's a preventable cancer, Dec. You can find it early. We have the way to find it earlier.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, there's been a lot of attention on what a poor test PSA is and all the limitations of PSA testing, but it still is the best biomarker we have.
It's the
to
best red
diagnose
flag.
prostate cancer early.
On its own, of course, it's got limitations, but it's a fantastic red flag to at least identify the group of men that you need to trawl through to find those that will benefit from early detection.
So Ben, we mentioned the Stephen Fry effect. So Stephen Fry, legendary UK actor, was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2019. It was a private thing, and he underwent surgery. You operated on him. You did a radical prostatectomy for Stephen Fry. And then I was rereading a lot of the media this week, and it sounds like, you know, he was beginning to get queries a few weeks later about, are you okay? The word does leak out. And he was about to travel to California, where himself and his partner have a home, I think, and he decided to release a video. He did a video. You're smiling. You're obviously remembering this. But then he released a very powerful video to his millions and millions of followers, but then chose to really go public with the story. And this Stephen Fry effect of tens of thousands of extra tests being done and people in research happening. And you and he wrote a very special piece in Nature Reviews Urology that got picked up here in the Financial Review in Australia and papers worldwide. So do you want to take us back to the Stephen Fry effect and all that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Declan. It was an odd morning. He actually texted me and said, I'm about to get on a plane to LA. I'm going to release a message. You may get some interaction with the press. And then I was just literally starting a robotic radical prostatectomy. So I did my normal thing and sort of put my phone to one side. And when I looked at my phone at the end of it, my phone was going absolutely bananas because he'd sort of said I had this surgeon and everyone was going, what's happening there? And I said, oh, well, I think this is going to be a busy couple of months for us. I mean, so he actually said to me, I'm really sorry. I've made all your work much more difficult. And I said, Stephen, you've done a wonderful thing. Your honesty has saved many, many hundreds and thousands of men. And I think hopefully that's what Sir Chris will take from this as well as one of the positives in that. You know, he talks about he spoke to a friend who then got diagnosed and was treated effectively, and he's been like a sort of darling of the British press. You know, he's our Olympic man. 2012, he was the man, and that's not that long ago that he was an elite athlete, and here he is, and I think it has shaken people. I mean, we've had several celebrities come out, and each one causes a positive blip in terms of interest, awareness, and subsequently testing.
Yeah, amazing. Very powerful, isn't it? So we're going to welcome Andrei Norris. Andrei is a patient who has a story not dissimilar in terms of family history. We're going to play a little bit about Chris Hoy's family history in a minute, but Andrei has told his story before. He is... What age are you now, Andrei?
I am 52. Thanks for the question.
52. So 52-year-old Andrei Norris.
Very young.
From Hobart. He's joining us from Hobart. And he and I are working together at the moment, actually, on this big task force that has been asked to review all of the PSA testing and early detection guidelines in Australia. It's a process going on for many months, led by Peter Heathcote, urologist, ex-USAN's president, and it involves GPs, patients, urologists, radiation oncologists, pathologists, media people, message policy people, and it's funded by, I think, PCFA, the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and we are under the aegis of the NHMRC, which is our national guideline body here, and we're tasked to update that guideline by mid next year. But Andrei, you know, you've been very active on the Patient Voice talking about the early detection thing. So you've already told us your story. I know you were diagnosed at the age of 45 with a locally advanced prostate cancer. You've got a family history. And what we want to focus a bit in this is the impact of family history in testing. So before we go to you on that, I'm going to play the clip where Chris Hoy talks a bit about his family history, because this is very striking. And I know Andrei was certainly very struck by this when he heard what Chris Hoy had to say about his family history and how maybe that should be playing into policy to try and identify people like Chris before they turn up with painful secondaries, which is what he did.
You know, looking back now, my grandpa died from prostate cancer. My dad has had it, has been treated for it. So it is a genetic thing, it is in the family, but it can happen to anybody. 1 in 8 men will have prostate cancer in their life at some point, but If you've got family history of it, like I have, if you're over the age of 45, go and ask your doctor. It's not painful, it's not awkward, there's nothing difficult about it. It's just a blood test.
Do you think that the screening system for men should be different?
I believe that the screening for men with a strong family history of prostate cancer, it should be a lot younger. It's logical to me that why would you not just get the test a little bit earlier, catch it before you need to have any major treatment? To me, it seems a no-brainer.
There you go, no-brainer. What do you think about that, Andrei?
Oh, look, absolutely. Couldn't echo those comments more. It's an absolute tragedy for men to be diagnosed with, serious stage 4 cancer in their 40s. Why aren't we testing? This happens to other men. It's absolutely fantastic that Chris and Stephen have come out in the media and raised the profile of this. But, there are thousands of men going through this process and this experience. I think it's time that we fill the gap and we stop those men falling into a hole and give them a chance.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And prostate cancer is unique in many ways, but one of the things are the risk factors for prostate cancer. And unlike smoking, which is associated with other cancers such as lung and bladder cancer, with prostate cancer, I think one of the most significant risk factors is family history. And that significantly increases your baseline risk of prostate cancer. And I think it's important to identify these men early. Ben, in the UK, are things different? Are there additional risk factors that we should be aware of? I mean, family history, genetic mutations, all very important.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a national screening policy. Obviously, we have that for breast, we have that cervical, we have that for colorectal. And there has been a long debate about the benefits and versus the harms of a national screening program. But what I think everybody is very, coming together on now is that the risk factors that we particularly have that you're alluding to is that we have a large African and Caribbean population, and their risk is double. So if you get a man who's African or Caribbean background, these black men, and who also have a family history, it's a multiplier. And that is a real challenge for us. Over half of the men we operate on in our hospital are Afro-Caribbean. Yeah. So it's something we see every single week, and people being detected too late. And we've done some work, Declan and I, we were on a paper 15 years ago about if you do that very early PSA test, even if it's not, in inverted commas, raised, it still gives you a trigger as to then how often afterwards you should have it tested. So if it's 2, you say it's not technically raised, but it's getting that way. You want to be on it reasonably quickly, whereas if it's 0.6, you can be pretty reassured. So I think PSA is very good, particularly if it's very low at reassuring, and the middle ones we've got to track.
See, Ben, you make a very good point there. Family history is very important, but the problem with family history is it's flawed. There was a recent analysis that I saw presented in Queensland of a group of nearly 2,000 men who had their prostates out, and they went back and looked at men between 40 and 50, and they found that there was a significant number of men who had no family history but had significant prostate cancer at a young age. And the problem with family history is, what about the number of men who don't really know what their dad had because they didn't talk about it? Yeah. Or they had plenty of men who died early, so never got the chance to get prostate cancer, and what happens to their sons and their family history. So, as you say, a more objective and scientific measure would be a test at 40, which was actually over 10 years ago postulated and endorsed in Australia, by the way, by the College of Pathologists, which could predict your risk,
and if you're
much
low,
like family
fine.
history.
And if you're medium,
Correct.
then keep checking, and if you're high, then take some action.
These should be really taken into account, and I really I endorse what you're doing, Declan, and also Andrei, and thank you so much for coming and sharing this, because it's so important to keep banging this drum. It's not acceptable that men with the commonest cause of male cancer death, that we don't have good, stratified, properly thought out screening programs.
And I'm sure Chris Hoy is wondering, I wonder what my PSA was when I was 40.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't said it exactly. He's written a book, by the way. I think there's a book just released about it. But I think he turned up with pain in his bones, age 40. A total nightmare scenario, isn't it? And he's probably thinking then, I wonder what my PSA was when I was 40 or when I was 45. And we always wonder that when someone turns up at a very young age. So I think from 50 upwards, Andrei, you can see within the guideline group, they're going to be guided by the ERSPC and so on. Well-informed men with a good life expectancy should consider a PSA test from 50 to upwards, because we have screening data on that. It's the ones in the 40s. So you were diagnosed age 45 with lymph node positive prostate cancer on a PET scan. You ended up, you don't mind me revealing, you've spoken about it before, a radical prostatectomy, subsequent radiotherapy. subsequent stereotactic radiotherapy for further recurrence, subsequent ADT and abiraterone, all in your chemotherapy,
and chemo,
all in your mid to late 40s.
Could have been avoided with a PSA test. The whole lot, well, not all of it, but could have been detected at a stage where it was curable just through a radical prostatectomy through a simple PSA test between the age 40 and 45. It's that simple.
Did you know you were BRCA2 at that time?
Not at all. Not at all.
So my BRCA2
diagnosis was initially they tested my bloodline, my germline, following my initial diagnosis because it was unusual that I was diagnosed so early with aggressive cancer. There was something a bit strange about that. But fortunately, that confirmed I didn't have a BRCA mutation. I had, I think, one of 90-odd mutations, which was an unknown. And then after my recurrence, my oncologist thought, let's test the prostate tissue itself. And that confirmed the BRCA2 somatic mutation in that tissue.
These are the families we want to find, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say, Andrei, to the government decision last year in Australia to decide to only fund one PSA every 2 years for men now, and they dropped that funding back? Isn't that outrageous? Would you agree?
I think it's outrageous. I think it's nuts. Every time I go to have a PSA test, and I have them every 3 months, and I'm living with, aggressive and incurable prostate cancer, I'm thinking, are they going to charge me for this? If we want to support men to be aware of their health and to be proactive about their health, every Australian man has a 1 in 6 chance of developing prostate cancer. This is a pretty big one on the men's health radar. We should be supporting and encouraging men, to be and have the PSA screening test. It's a screening test. It's not a definitive diagnosis, but it's remarkable, in what it's achieved, combined with other tools.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrei. And Ben and Dan, if we're thinking of bringing, the screening age earlier, surely we should also think about adjuncts to PSA, like bringing things like MRI into the screening setting. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know there's a lot of work in the UK looking at that, biparametric MRI in the screening population, but we do need to also put in some effort to streamline that diagnostic pathway, don't we?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's, a London group at UCH and from Imperial College have done a work on this, making MRI simpler, as in not requiring an injection. That takes it from a sort of try to a bi, so 3 things to a 2-thing MRI, and that's been shown. They call that a prostagram or a manogram, and they've actually looked at that without PSA testing, as in comparing the two, and found that they did find some tumours with that, with just doing the MRI.
In those with low PSAs?
In those with low PSAs. Yeah. So arguably you pick up men even earlier before because the PSA, if it's extremely low, that's reassuring. But anything in the middle ground is then where you get a bit of, it's tricky, because obviously a big prostate, inflammation, infection. Of course, with the Hoy thing, I'm thinking, is he got chronic inflammation from all of the things he did? But maybe that's a source of a different podcast. But yeah, so then he would have been picked up, and he would have gone on to have that secondary test, and someone somewhere has obviously advised him, because it sounds like he has thought about it, not to have a test till he was 50, and that was obviously not a good decision in his case. And if he'd had a test at 40, 45 even, but certainly mid-40s, that would have helped.
Yeah, more knowledge too about the nature of PSA testing in younger men. I remember going to a hospital bed to visit a man that I operated on, and his son happened to be visiting. This man was in his 70s, his son was in his 40s, and I said, gosh, make sure, just a community health message, you need to be tested as well. He said, no, I'm fine, I had my PSA tested, it was 3, it's fine. I said, you're in your 40s, you need to come and see me. And I took his prostate out 3 months later.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it's that opportunistic screening, understanding the PSA, how to use it in different settings.
So Ben, back to the Chris Hoy effect, because what I noticed is that when he came out public, like huge media coverage, but also the health secretary in the UK, the health minister, stood up in the Commons and made some comments like in direct reaction to the Chris Hoy thing. So this is back to the Chris Hoy effect. And I can't remember, did he say we're looking at this, especially the Andrei, Chris people, the men in the 40s with a family history, or maybe the Afro-Caribbeans or the BRCA2s, But it does shift policy a bit.
I respect him for that. I mean, Wes Streeting is he's a guy he's had a kidney tumour that he's been open about at an early age that was found due to not screening but due to testing, because he had some sort of scan, CT or MRI that picked it up, and that's probably saved his life. So I think he's obviously very much on the same page that he dodged a bullet, and he's speaking about Sir Chris, who's a favourite of the whole country that everyone loves. He's such a lovely guy. And it sounds like he is going to get his teeth stuck into this, and we may see some policy change.
And Andrei, I think I feel a sense of that, because when you put together these huge task forces that include people from every angle, not just the urologists who have quite a blinkered view that we should be doing testing very early, but people who, have to satisfy evidence-based medicine standards and have to balance, the pros and cons, etc. But I've sensed within the group even the Chris Hoy effect, and I'm not sure how many gold medals you've won for elite pursuits, but the voice of a patient like yourself on these task forces is incredibly powerful. I see it in the interchange with the others in the task force when you make a comment and you write very beautifully about your own perspective. So, what are your thoughts on that, the direction of travel?
Look, I think the gold medals are yet to come, but I think we have to think really hard about this. So yes, the evidence would say there's only a relatively small number of men in their 40s being diagnosed with, prostate cancer. But what's starting to emerge, and I think Dan might have referred to it, is studies that are showing that the genesis of prostate cancer for men who are being diagnosed with incurable cancer in their 50s is in their 40s. And even more so, obviously, for men who are diagnosed in their 40s, in their late 40s. The genesis is in their earlier 40s. I'm an example of that. And the cost to these men, to their families, the trauma. I don't want to whine about this, but it's enormous, and we have to take that seriously. And we have to look at, are there shifting sands here? The previous guidelines were developed, 10 years ago. At the time, the harms of testing were very much front and centre of overdiagnosis. Are we in a state now, and you talked about, advances in testing and diagnosis that are far less invasive and non-invasive in many ways? Has the balance shifted now such that we can say that, it makes sense to be testing these men?
Andrei, can I just raise one question for both you and Declan, who are on this task force? Over 10 years ago, I think it was 2011, the Cancer Council guidelines they were created for the first time, and this is the update of these guidelines. In those guidelines over 10 years ago, they endorsed PSA testing from the age of 50, and they also endorsed a single PSA test age 40 for exactly the reason that Ben and I have talked about. Yet to this day, the GPs refuse to change the guidelines, and to this day, their recommendations are still against PSA testing. So can you be sure that if we take this next step and update them again, and will you be able to ensure that message is passed and received through the appropriate primary healthcare guidelines?
I think that's a really big part. It's a really big part of the task of the review of the guidelines. It's a really big challenge for the Prostate Cancer Foundation itself, is to support the guidelines that we actually land on and make sure that they're appropriately and easily understood and communicated, that we have decision tools for GPs to inform them in the conversation with men, and a conversation that's based on a recommendation that is in those guidelines. So yes, absolutely, the communication, the consistency and the cohesion between, the guidelines and GP practice is fundamental to this, because that's the person you go to see. For example, when I saw my GP with my 2 reading, my urologist subsequently said that reading should have triggered further testing, a bit late. So, we need greater awareness of some of the nuance around testing, and we need to get these guidelines right. They're going to be there for another 10 years, and ultimately, men's lives depend on them.
Yeah. And Dan, I remember those days, because just for audience out there, we have these kind of national guidelines, but then the GPs have a very important book. They call it the Red Book in Australia, which is a guide to preventative medicine, how you take steps to reduce cardiovascular disease and cancer incidence and so on. And they've traditionally had a very, very negative view on early detection of prostate cancer, and that's what you're talking about. Back then, the Red Book in 2012, 13, 14 said, do not bring it up. Don't even mention it. Even if you've got an Andrei Norris or a Chris Hoy in front of you and you looked after his dad and his granddad who died, it says, don't mention it. But it's definitely changed, and they've updated it this year, and it's much more, I think, pragmatic, and it's much more shared decision making, talking to patients about the pros and cons, but taking into account these matters. And what we're trying to do is align these national guidelines that we're working on with that. So what you don't want is different things. The GPs will go for their red book thing, but we want everyone to be singing from the same hymn sheet and offer men the chance to make a decision rather than just say never mention it. But,
I mean, on a lighter note, I think one thing I'm really struck by, and Chris has spoken very publicly about this, is that despite everything, he still remains very positive. His mental state is great. He feels fit. He's ready to take on whatever is there in the future. And I look at Andrei, and he's been through the entire armamentarium of treatment for prostate cancer, and you look great. And I'm reminded back to our podcast with Tim Baker and the importance of exercise, diet, sleep. And I think all of those things are really important, especially for young men who are diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer. It's what helps you get through treatment. And face these difficult circumstances.
And there will be young men listening to this podcast or watching this podcast in that exact same thing, or they have loved ones who are in the same thing, in or around the same age group. And Ben, have you any messages on that? I mean, you're a big advocate for exercise. You're a very keen cyclist yourself. I know Chris Hoy is one of your heroes. The Chris Hoy story it's amazing. He's come out. It'll change all sorts of things, won't it? But I love Renu's comment that you can see a lot of good in this. And I'm going to go and buy his book actually next week. I'll buy you a copy as well.
It's going to be great to read for all of us involved in this space. I mean, I'm sure you all had as well many patients who've really sort of focused on their physical and mental health at the time of their diagnosis. And there is some evidence that exercise almost is a therapy. There are people out there who are pushing that. Hopefully alongside other traditional medical therapies, but I've got many people who feel that it has made a significant difference to their physical and mental well-being by stepping up the exercise. Chris Hoy is going to be leaving no stone unturned on that one. He's got a bike ride for I think a whole range of diseases, of stage 4 diseases. It's called the stage 4 tour or something, and he's going to do. And he's setting out for anybody with advanced disease of any type of cancer is going to join him on a big ride next year. So he's going to do some amazing stuff.
And actually, because his wife was diagnosed with MS just after he was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. What a tough year! Amazing. So great. We'll wrap it up on another happy note to finish. Just to tell an inspiring story. There's a patient of mine. I remember getting a referral in the door. This is more than 10 years ago, like a week before Christmas. Kindly see this 50-year-old with pain in his back and a PSA of 1,000. Right? So you get that referral a week before Christmas, and here in Australia everything shuts for like 6 weeks at that time. So I ring up the patient and get him in to see him, and he has a bone scan. He's got just extensive skeletal metastases and a PSA of 1,000, and he's fit. He's a university lecturer and he loves cycling, and he's still here like 11 or 12 years later. Yeah. And he's hardly even used up many of the guns, because back then we just put him on ADT. That's all we had. And only in the last year or two, we've put him on an AR pathway inhibitor. Like he, by every prediction, poor fellow would have died, within 3 years or 4 years of that. And he blogs about it. He blogs about it on the university website. And one of the things he credits with his success, not just his well-being, but his cancer treatment, is velotherapy. Velotherapy. He cycles like a lunatic. Velo, bicycle. Yeah. He cycles, and he's come on charity rides with us, and he does his own bike rides, and he's posts pictures in the blog when he falls off the bike. He cycles hundreds of kilometers all the time with extensive bone metastases. Very, very inspiring. So these inspiring patients,
like Andrei, I was just going to say, Chris so Hoy, inspiring, and we're so
Tim
grateful.
Baker, a friend of the podcast. We despair when we make these diagnoses and hearing Chris's story early on, but we love hearing when people will make the most of this and do inspiring things to help inspire others out there.
Absolutely.
All right, what a podcast! What
a podcast!
Yeah, and that's all we have time for on this episode of the podcast. It's been supported by our friends at Bayer Australia, who are silver partners of the podcast. We're very grateful to them as ever for supporting all we do. Thanks very much to Andrei for dialing in and joining us, and thanks very much to Ben Challacombe and Dan Moon for joining us in the studio as well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's all we have time for on this episode of GUcast. We do hope you have a good time, and
we'll see you next time.